Thank you, Father Shea, and good morning to all of you. I am honored to be with you this morning and to speak with you about this, as Father Shea said, very important topic, but also a very complicated topic and a problem which has plagued our country for far too long, the problem of racism. It has raised its head in numerous ways, and we have an opportunity now to confront racism, to confront it head on, and to find better ways of relating to each other and recognizing each other as created in the image and likeness of God. So let's take a look at the issue of racism and then consider some ways that we together might be able to make a dent in this problem as we go forward. Nearly 35 years ago, a Catholic organization sponsored a conference entitled Voices of Justice, the challenge of being Catholic and American in the 1980s. One of the keynote speakers was Union Theological Seminary professor and author James Cone, and he issued a theological challenge to the Catholic Church. He said this: "What is it about the Catholic definition of justice that makes many persons of that faith progressive in their attitudes toward the poor in Central America, but reactionary in their views toward the poor in Black America? It is the failure of the Catholic Church to deal effectively with the problem of racism that causes me to question the quality of its commitment to justice. I do not wish to minimize the importance of Catholic contributions to poor people's struggles for justice, but I must point out the ambiguity of the Catholic stand on justice when racism is not addressed forthrightly." Cone's reservations concerning the adequacy and effectiveness of American Catholic reflection on racism as directed towards African Americans also has been expressed by official voices within the American Catholic Church. In 1989, the U.S. Bishops' Committee on Black Catholics issued a statement commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Bishops' Conference's only pastoral letter concerning racism, entitled Brothers and Sisters to Us. Sadly, this anniversary committee found little worth celebrating. It concluded that the promulgation of the pastoral letter on racism was soon forgotten by all but a few. A survey revealed a pathetic, anemic response from archdioceses and dioceses around the country. The pastoral letter on racism had made little or no impact on the majority of Catholics in the United States. In spite of all that had been said and written about racism in the last 20 years, very little, if anything at all, has been done. Such it was yesterday, it is today. Then 2 years ago, at a symposium celebrating the centenary anniversary of modern Catholic social teaching, Joseph Francis, an African-American bishop, declared that the lack of attention given to brothers and sisters to us made it what he called the best-kept secret in the church in this country. He concluded by voicing similar sentiments to those expressed by Cone. He said, "Social justice vis-a-vis the eradication of racism in our church is simply not a priority of social concern commissions, social concern directors, and agencies. While I applaud the concern of such individuals and the groups who work for justice for people from Eastern Europe, China, and Latin America, that same concern is not expressed, is not incarnate for the victims of racism in this country. The question is the quality of our mercy strained when Black people are concerned. Finally, in 2004, 25 years after the publication of Brothers and Sisters to Us, the U.S. bishops commissioned a study to discern its implications and reception. The commission's results paint a disheartening picture of the church's relationship with the Black community. For example, since Brothers and Sisters to Us was first promulgated, only 18% of American bishops have issued statements condemning racism, and of those, very few address the systemic racism found in our country. Rather, they address personal attitudes of direct racial malice. In addition, the commission noted that many diocesan seminaries and ministry formation programs are inadequate in terms of their incorporation of the history, culture, and traditions of the Black community. More disturbing is the Commission's report that white Catholics over the last 25 years have, quote unquote, exhibited diminished rather than increased support of government policies aimed at curbing racial inequality. These official reflections detail the significant lack of compliance of the American Church with its own recommendations concerning Brothers and Sisters to Us and how it should be implemented. While racism is America's most persistent sin, it appears that the American Catholic Church has continued to be virtually silent about its significance in its seminaries, its churches, and in every other segment of larger American Catholic life. Which leads to the question, why? What is the place of race in the American Catholic imagination? And how do we begin to confront racism in realistic, concrete, and tangible ways? Most expressions of racism today, at least racism directed against African Americans, can be traced back directly to our nation's involvement with the transatlantic slave trade during colonial times. Therefore, it would be prudent for us to begin our investigation at that point in American history. But in order to set the stage for the American experience, we need to examine the attitudes of the early church. The issue of slavery is one that historically has been treated with concern by the Catholic Church. After the recognition of Christianity within the Roman Empire, there was a growing sentiment that many kinds of slavery were not compatible with Christian conceptions of charity and justice. Some argued against all forms of slavery, while others argued the case for slavery subject to certain restrictions. Initially, church teaching made a distinction between just and unjust forms of slavery, with unjust slavery being what was imposed upon people who had not been baptized. Over time, abject slavery diminished in Christian Europe, but it was often replaced with indentured servitude, which in some circumstances turned out to be just as destructive as slavery. But with the advent of European imperialism into the African continent, slavery once again came to the fore. In response to the enslavement of people of color, Pope Eugene IV authored a papal bull, Sicut Dictum, in 1435, which addressed this issue. He sent his letter to Bishop Ferdinand in the Portuguese colonies of the Canary Islands. Pope Eugene condemned the enslavement of the indigenous people that had converted to the faith. Consequently, he commanded, quote, that all and each of the faithful, within the space of 15 days of the publication of this letter, in places where they lived, be restored to their earlier liberty, end quote. This directive was issued, the Pope said, under pain of excommunication. A century later, as Europe expanded into the Americas, the church again responded to the evil of slavery. This time it was Pope Paul III with his encyclical Sublimus Deus. However, Sublimus Deus presents a slightly different understanding of slavery. Paul III was not concerned about articulating the meaning of a just or unjust slavery. Rather, he asserted that whoever is endowed with the capability to receive the faith of Jesus Christ and receives his gospel, baptized or not, should by no means be deprived of their liberty or the possession of their property. This clearly was an advancement in the church's position on slavery, and as such, created some apprehension among Catholic colonists in North America. Apprehension, yes, but thoughts of abolition, no. The reason was that as the colonies began to expand, so did the institution of slavery, at least in the South. Thus, for many, slavery had become so entrenched in the fabric of the colonies that its complete abolition was considered an unrealistic concept. In 1839, Pope Gregory XVI issued another document entitled In Supremo, an apostolic letter that condemned the slave trade in the strongest possible terms. By that time, slavery had been completely abolished in Britain, while Spain and Portugal continued to participate in slave trading. Pope Gregory had hoped that his apostolic letter might persuade Spain and Portugal to outlaw slavery. Sadly, it did not. But in the United States, the Pope's pronouncement at least initiated a debate within the Catholic community. The Catholic population of the United States, which had been 35,000 in 1790, increased to 195,000 by 1820, and then ballooned to about 1.6 million by the time of Gregory's apostolic letter, making Catholicism the country's largest single religion. As the Catholic ranks swelled, mainly as a result of immigration, arguments raged over exactly what Gregory's letter meant. While some people put forward Gregory's letter to make the case that the church opposed any and all forms of slavery, other American Catholic leaders sought to interpret the apostolic letter in the narrowest possible fashion in order to minimize its significance. The fact of the matter was that many bishops in the South were slave owners. For them, slavery was not simply an institution to be endured, but instead it was a blessing for black people. For example, 4 months after the beginning of the Civil War, Bishop Auguste Martin wrote a pastoral letter to his flock in northern Louisiana, in which he stated, "The manifest will of God is that in exchange for a freedom of which they are incapable, and for a labor of a whole life, we should give these unfortunate ones their legitimate portion of the truth and the goods of grace, which console them in their present miseries." Considered from this point of view, slavery was not really an evil, but rather a means for a degraded class to better itself. Moreover, the bishop argued that slavery was an eminently Christian work because it led to the redemption of millions of souls. Thus, Martin attempted to introduce a theological justification for slavery. It was something noble because it was God's plan for the conversion of black people who were dependent on the white race. Now, here it is important to point out that these negative attitudes towards blacks in the Catholic community were not unique to the South. Even in the North, the sentiments of the Catholic laity, most of whom, as I mentioned a moment ago, were recent immigrants, were decidedly anti-black. In the years leading up to and during the Civil War, and even after the destruction of institutional slavery following the Civil War, there were few white Catholics who really believed that blacks were equal to whites. Just as their Protestant contemporaries, white Catholics bore an assumption of black inferiority. To say it differently, the subordination of blacks in America was simply an accepted part of the social and cultural landscape for Catholics and non-Catholics alike. Despite these negative notions, there was always a remnant of Catholics that worked diligently to advance race relations in the United States. One of those individuals who was responsible for such an effort was a man by the name of Daniel Rudd. By the end of the 19th century, Rudd had made himself known to both clergy and laity as the leading Catholic representative of the black race. In his newspaper, the American Catholic Tribune, Rudd wrote, "The Catholic Church alone can break the color line. Our people should help her to do it." With this sentiment, Rudd developed the idea of a National Congress of African American Catholics. He believed that black Catholics did not realize how many co-religionists they had. Being separated and hidden away from each other due to vast differences and distances, Rudd thought it would be beneficial to the church and to faithful black Catholics to come together and simply speak and look upon one another. The first Black Catholic Congress took place in January 1889. The Congress delegates, numbering approximately 200, made appeals to labor organizations, factory owners, trade unions, and other businesses to admit black men to their ranks. They spoke of children and the need of orphanages, hospitals, and Catholic schools. Subsequent Black Catholic Congresses stressed the church's need to preserve the deposit of faith regarding the equality of all people before God. The meetings consistently reminded the church of the mission to announce love in place of hate and to raise up the downtrodden and to proclaim the essential value of all men and women. Along with the Black Catholic Congress, in 1909, another important movement among black Catholics began in Mobile, Alabama, through the initiative of several pastors from the Josephite order. The Knights of Peter Claver were founded to be a national organization of black men to foster fellowship and bring about a spiritual awareness and interest in the church's traditions. In 1922, a ladies' auxiliary was instituted within the organization. These two groups, the Knights and Ladies of Peter Claver, became important elements in the religious life of black Catholics. Many members worked on civil rights issues and collaborated with organizations such as the NAACP and the National Urban League. Nonetheless, most Catholic parishes remained segregated along racial lines during the first half of the 20th century. Some dioceses created separate parishes for blacks, while in other areas, blacks could attend any Catholic church, but often had to sit in the rear of the church or in the balcony, and were unable to receive Holy Communion until every white parishioner had already received. Some parishes even placed screens between the seating areas of blacks and whites. Fortunately, there were always Catholics who refused to accept segregation and its consequences. The Southeastern Regional Interracial Commission, founded in 1948 by students from Loyola and Xavier's universities, both Jesuit schools, held interracial masses on college campuses. The Commission on Human Rights, organized in 1949, held interracial masses and sent petitions to church officials demanding integration in Southern parishes. These were hopeful signs, but very limited in scope. Moving forward in history, the Catholic Church's role during segregation and the civil rights movement can best be described as ambiguous, complicated, and worthy of a lecture of its own. Suffice it to say here that there were many Catholic leaders, including bishops, pastors, religious women, and university presidents, who risked their lives to support the cause of racial justice. But in the judgment of most historians, they were the exception to the rule. For the most part, the Catholic Church and its rank and file members remained on the sidelines and watched from afar. After the civil rights movement, undoubtedly, some progress was made. But recent events in our country have questioned exactly how far we have come. When considering the history of race in the Catholic Church, one cannot help but wonder why, in the United States, there was so little social consciousness among Catholics regarding racism. As the global church has championed human dignity and equality, and as Pope Paul VI asserted that the church must work to address social inequalities by, quote, building a human community where men and women can truly live human lives, free from discrimination on account of race, religion, or nationality, end quote. Why does it appear that the Church in America has been incapable of taking decisive action and incapable of enunciating clear-cut principles regarding racism that have led to a change of attitude? Along with their Protestant brothers and sisters, American Catholics have shown a lack of moral consciousness on the issue of race. Clearly, at times, our faith has influenced our racial attitudes. But negative events in our country, which have targeted not only African Americans, but also Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Jews, and immigrants, targeted each one primarily on the basis of race, force us to realize that the discussions on equality must run much deeper. If we are to be true to the principles on which our country was founded and the principles on which our faith is based, we must do much more. In his letter to the Ephesians, St. Paul tells us that Jesus is our peace. It is by means of his shed blood and broken body that the dividing walls of enmity have been demolished. Today, the Catholic Church in America must recognize that Christ wishes to break down the walls created by the evils of racism, whether that evil is displayed publicly for all to see or buried deep in the recesses of our hearts. If not, we are destined for history to continue to repeat itself, and once again, the Church will be perceived as a silent observer in the face of racism. On August 23rd of last year, Cardinal Daniel DiNardo, the president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, established an ad hoc committee against racism. The committee will focus on addressing the sin of racism in our society and even in our church, and the urgent need to come together as a nation to find solutions. I have been given the privilege of serving as the chair of this committee, and while I realize that the task appears overwhelming, I am committed to the goal of helping the church become a consistent and productive voice in eradicating this plague. Nearly 40 years ago, brothers and sisters to us asserted that racism is a sin that divides the human family and violates the fundamental human dignity of those called to be children of the same Father. The bishops and lay members of the Committee Against Racism will have the opportunity to listen to the needs of individuals across our country who have suffered from the sin of racism. They will have the opportunity to bring members of the Black community, the Hispanic community, Asian community, Native American community, and all people of different races to one table to work with us to find solutions to this epidemic of hate that has plagued our nation for far too long. Through listening, prayer, and meaningful collaboration, I am hopeful that we can find those lasting solutions that we so much need, and also find common ground where racism will no longer find a place in our hearts or in our society. One initial effort, which will occur next month, will be an ecumenical gathering of religious leaders to frankly talk about the many faces of racism that emerge across our country. Another initiative will be the organization of the listening sessions, which I mentioned around the country, to better understand racism and how best to respond. We are also planning on organizing a national conversation on race in our parishes, schools, and by schools I mean elementary, secondary, colleges, and university. Also in our seminaries, our Catholic charities organizations, our Catholic health associations, and social service organizations, in every Catholic organization throughout the country. The goal will be to allow people to listen to each other, to exchange ideas, to become educated and change hearts. Too often, we as bishops issue statements which get placed on a shelf. This is not a time for statements. We are going to issue a pastoral letter on racism, but accompanying that pastoral letter will be a study guide that allows us during these listening sessions to encourage people to come together and to overcome their hesitations and their fears and talk frankly to each other with the goal of changing attitudes and behavior. To that end, we will begin with the theological concept of our shared commitment to community. Some 20 years after the closing of the Second Vatican Council, the Synod of Bishops stated, quote, "The ecclesiology of communion is the central and fundamental idea of the Council's documents. It is the foundation for order in the Church and especially for a correct relationship between unity and pluriformity in the Church," end quote. Papal and episcopal documents following Vatican II have made more explicit the mission of the Church to create community, and have done so by connecting social justice with the ecclesiology of communion. Pope Paul VI's encyclical, Populorum Progressio, noted that the social question, quote, "tied all human beings together," end quote. In another apostolic letter, Pope Paul VI emphasized the need for greater justice and the necessity of greater attention to be focused on the need to recognize the place and dignity of marginalized groups, such as, he mentioned, the handicapped, the maladjusted, the old, groups on the fringe of society, which would include Black Americans. In fact, Paul VI particularly noted the suffering of victims discriminated against because of race, origin, color, culture, sex, or religion. Pope Francis has said the same repeatedly, especially when he talks about how important it is that we go to the fringes of society and how the Church should be a field hospital for those in need. In imitation of Christ, the Church's action and teaching must unite us in an indivisible way by means of fostering a beloved community. In imitation of Christ, we, the Church, must be willing to give our total lives over to the liberation of women and men by defending the dignity and fundamental rights of every human person. And this includes a visible denouncement of racism. This commitment to community and a recommitment to ecclesial communion is an integral part of reconciliation. A social approbation of ecclesial communion will require a radical conversion by the church, in which she first acknowledges the sinful nature of the systems of oppression within its own ecclesial institutions and society. Second, the church must then seek the forgiveness of those that she has victimized by her past injustices. Third, both parties must then work together toward human solidarity rooted in their shared emphasis on communion. Within the church, this reconciliation can be manifested in the development of more inclusive patterns of relationship between people of color and the church. These patterns must allow for full participation by Black, Hispanic, and other people of color who are faithful members of the church in decision-making, as well as ministerial and social actions which the church undertakes. The Catholic social justice tradition, as illustrated in the life of Christ and evident in his Gospels, impels the church to break her silence about the marginalization, devaluation, and systematic oppression of Blacks and Hispanics and other groups within the ecclesial, social, economic, and political institutions of the nation. Another area of progress would be for the church to engage the new theological voices that have emerged from the lay faithful who have researched and experienced being Black, Hispanic, Asian, or Native American, and also Catholic. In the same spirit, Black and Hispanic theological voices can continue to mature and deepen their understanding of Catholic theologians whose cultural backgrounds differ from their own. Such a theological dialogue will reveal areas of continuity and discontinuity. While new questions will be raised, new understandings of community will undoubtedly emerge. If race in the Catholic imagination is to exemplify the love of Christ, it must move forward with the realization that no one can enter into full communion with the Lord if his or her relationship is marked by indifference or oppression toward others. One can become one with others only if he or she can speak the truth of one's sinful past, asking and granting forgiveness, and reaching out to one another in a spirit of reconciling love and solidarity. Communion and community are the patterns manifested in the triune God. This oneness can serve as a model of ecclesial and human communion. Only when the American Catholic Church speaks and lives in truth can she be a church whose patterns of relationship become a sacrament of radical unity in the midst of diversity. To get to that truth, we must break the silent complicity with the social evil of racism that has marred the past and continues to mar the present reality of America. Therefore, with trust in the Holy Spirit and rooted in the courage of the saints, let us begin to see every human being as created in the image of likeness of God, and leave behind the comfortable attitudes of superiority and fear. Thank you.